Welcome, my friends, to another Johnny Vedmore read through with me, your host, Johnny Vedmore. And we are going through time again today, like we always do. We always go through time. And we are on my Black Hand series, and we're on number 5 of the Black Hand series. Now, there's 7 episodes to the Black Hand series, including the Stanley Setti murder episodes, number 6 and 7. And this is the 5th. This is really important. This is, we've gone through the Hod Dibbin, Mariella Novotny. We've gone through the nightclub murders. We've gone through Esme Gulan and the stuff where this all started. For me, especially where this all started was Esme Gulan and a song for Esmeralda. Who is still, when I think of her, I get like bubbles throughout me that I should tell her story, that I should be out there letting people know that there was this woman who existed and she was fantabulous and she was a great person and yet she was rewritten and etc. And I love this series. This series has been very important to me. And the 5th of this is called The Original Jeffrey Epstein. And it isn't an understatement. The guy who we're going to talk about, George Huntington Hartford II, was the original Jeffrey Epstein in oh so many ways. Not only was he a billionaire, not only did he have intelligence links, not only did he have a massive reach around, not only did he get involved in sex parties, not only was there compromise involved, not only did he have his own island, his own place in Palm Beach, his own place in New York and in France and in London. Not only did he fly around and hang around with all of the big wigs of the time, he was in every way, he even looked a little bit like Epstein. He was in every way connected generationally. Like there's this like cycle that happens of people who fit the same bill, and George Huntington Hartford II fits the same bill as Epstein, and you'll discover this is undeniable once you get down to the end, to the point where El Brillo Way, Epstein's house from hell in West Palm Beach in Florida, was actually designed by an architect called John Volk, who was the guy who designed George Huntington Hartford's whole Paradise Island. So, I mean, there's so many connections, even little ones like that, which are really surprising. I wouldn't be surprised if Epstein knew about George Huntington Hartford's reputation and etc., and kind of like aspired to be like him to an extent. They could have even talked at some point. We don't know. But what we're going to do now is share the screen with you, as we like to do on these Johnny Vedmore read-throughs. And you are now in my site. You are in newspaste.com. There's loads of drop-down menus with various articles that you can read, lots of articles, lots of series. A lot of my articles, I try to write my articles to be timeless, so you could read them at any time, and they're about history, they're about the past, so they'll teach you something, but they won't die or fade over time. They'll still be as important in 5 years, maybe even more important in 5, 10 years than they are now. It's a style of telling history, looking at history that I have as well. But there's lots to be found at Newspaste. Newspaste is flying. We've got it's been redesigned a little bit. Remember, if you like this content, buy me a coffee. Become a patron or donate on Ko-Fi. I need your help. I do need your help. I really do. I can't continue with this work unless I have your help. I don't get paid by anybody in particular. I was doing the TNT radio stuff. That ended. That was like a job for a while. Like had money coming in, but I'm not someone who makes masses of money. I'm not a big, a lot of people have a big pull, big support. I don't get any of that. So I need your help to create things like regular shows like News Hound and these Johnny Vedmore read-throughs like you're listening to now, and to write these long-form articles. I mean, the Third Way and the Third Culture articles took about a month to write and prepare, let alone all of the research time, because the Third Way was a year and a half, a year to a year and a half in research, and me and Darren Kenton having regular conversations about how to approach the article and what we needed to think about. But there's lots to be found at Newspace, lots to be found. I'm not a lazy character, so I try and do as much as possible. I've got loads of different shows, and for everybody who's just finding my work, you'll find that there's loads of it to take in, and a lot of it will have some form of relevance, will make sense to you. And here we go. We reached it. This is the title for the Black Hand series, and here are the different elements. There's Esmeralda Gulan, there's Barbara Knox Marsh, there's Hod Dibbin, the man, the devil himself, there's Mariella Novotny, and there's, well, over here, this is Brian Donald Hume, Donald Brian Hume, Brian Donald, yeah, but Donald Hume, who's the man who murdered Stanley Sett. You don't want to give it away. You'll find it yourself. And George Huntington Hartford II here. And this is the article proper for the Black Hand series, called The Original Jeffrey Epstein. And it is not an understatement, as you will see here. So let's get into it, my friends. In this Johnny Vedmore read-through, thanks you for joining me. Thank you for being with me. I really, really do appreciate your time. And I love the fact that you could come and you're willing to sit through this. I know some of you don't have the time to read these articles. This article is probably about 4,000 something words. Most of my articles are 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 words. So they are pretty hefty articles. So I understand that it's hard for people to find the time to read. And that's why I do these read-throughs. Here we go. Black Hand, number 5, the original Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't the only billionaire philanthropist who had houses in Palm Beach, New York, Paris, London, and an island paradise, and threw elite sex parties for the rich and famous. Meet George Huntington Hartford II, the original Jeffrey Epstein. There was once a wealthy billionaire philanthropist who owned houses in Palm Beach, New York, and France, as well as Caribbean island paradise where he hosted young girls for elite sex parties far away from prying eyes. Like the infamous pedophile people trafficker, Jeffrey Epstein, this Harvard graduate sent his employees into the streets to recruit young girls for him to coerce and molest. One such employee, Stephen Ward, a man who played a central role in the downfall of the British government in the early 1960s, reportedly recruited girls from the streets of London for this wealthy man, and even drew him a sketch of a young girl being pleasured by machines in peculiar ways. Also, like Epstein, this wealthy paedophile had significant intelligence ties, which ensured he was protected from prosecution. The person I speak of was richer than Epstein and had more properties than Epstein, yet, unlike Epstein, he was never caught, charged, or prosecuted for any of his crimes, eventually dying of old age in his 90s. This is the story of George Huntington Hartford II, a friend of Hod Dibbin and Stephen Ward, and a billionaire who was closely related to the intelligence-linked propaganda creators who were behind the invention of James Bond. George Huntington Hartford II, the original Jeffrey Epstein. Here, just to say, Anagoni and Steele's forgeries of Huntington Hartford's signatures from the nightclub at Esmeralda Gulan's Montrose Club, Evening Standard, 18th of December, 1954. These are, we'll explain this now. Sitting at a table at Esmeralda Gulan's Montrose Club one evening in the mid-1950s was a young actress who went by the name Marjorie Steele. She wasn't just an actress, she was also a master forger who, on the night in question, was reportedly competing with the artist Pietro Annigoni to see who could best reproduce her husband's signature. Steele was her stage name, with her married name being Huntington Hartford. Marjorie had married into a very wealthy family. Her husband was George Huntington Hartford II, who was born 18th of April 1911 in New York City and had inherited his vast wealth from his grandfather, George Huntington Hartford I. When Huntington Hartford was just 6 years old, he began receiving an annual income of $1.5 million. His grandfather had created the concept of chain grocery stores after taking over the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P, and had amassed a great fortune. Huntington Hartford II's father, Edward, was not as interested as his brothers in creation of excessive wealth and slowly distanced himself from the wider family, once declaring that at least one Hartford ought to be a gentleman. George's mother, Henrietta, was also unlike the rest of the family, and this led to a persisting rift. Edward's brother had refused to help their siblings financially, and eventually Edward went so far as to break off contact with them. Edward would also do the same with his own children before his death in 1922. Josephine Bryce, George's sister, said before her death in 1992, "I don't think Hunt ever saw him at all." If the absence of his father wasn't bad enough for George, his mother also negatively impacted his psychological development. Henrietta Huntington Hartford was a domineering mother, and George was her favorite child. He became the focus of most of her attention, and his sister later described her mother as smothering him in a cocoon of motherly love. In a lengthy article published in Vanity Fair on the life of George Huntington Hartford entitled Hostage to Fortune on the 12th of June 2010, it was said that Henrietta would still lean across the dinner table when George was a teenager to cut his meat for him. That article, which contained quotes from a disheveled 93-year-old George Huntington Hartford, also notes that he scowled at the memory of his mother, telling the reporter, "She was domineering, very domineering." She sent Hartford away to school at St. Paul's in New Hampshire, where George was reportedly bullied constantly by the other students for being from New Money. He stated, "I was very innocent 12-year-old, and I was sent to a very horrible place. My mother should never have done it." While making the latter statement, Huntington Hartford is also noted as having raised his voice in distress at the memory. It was clear from an early life of George Huntington Hartford II that his development had been stunted in many ways by the absence of his father and the overbearing nature of his mother. It is also very clear that from his later life, that he had kept much of his hatred and anger for his family hidden inside. This is George Huntington Hartford II and Marjorie Steele, pictured 3 days after their 1949 wedding in the Fort Worth Star Telegram, Sunday, the 18th December 1960. In 1931, Huntington Hartford eloped with his first wife, Mary Lee Epling, the daughter of a dentist from West Virginia, a decision which apparently caused his mother to throw herself onto the floor and weep. The pair were regularly found mingling with other members of the American high society, but the marriage came to an end in 1939 after his wife left him for the actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. This was mainly due to Huntington Hartford chasing skirt, but also because he had impregnated a 23-year-old chorus girl named Mary Barton. Unfortunately for Mary Lee Epling, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. himself was a notorious rascal and would become a future attendee of Horace Dibbins' elite sex parties. Huntington Hartford had reportedly floated the idea of his mother adopting Mary Lee Epling so that he might keep her as a sister after their divorce. That's George Huntington Hartford, pictured alongside his first wife, Mary Lee Epling. This is from July 1986 Vanity Fair. Huntington Hartford graduated from Harvard University in 1934, where he'd studied English literature. Only a couple of years after graduation, he bought a sailing ship named Joseph Conrad, a rare square rigger sailboat that he purchased from the famed writer and adventurer Alan Villiers. Huntington Hartford soon became an avid sailor, taking part in ocean races such as the one reported on 28th of August 1937, an event where he and Walter S. Gubelman raced from Newport, Rhode Island to the Bahamas. After graduating from Harvard, Huntington Hartford went to work for his uncle A&P Company's headquarters. However, his uncles were apparently keen to make George's entry into the family business difficult. They put him in the statistical department of the company, where he oversaw the tracking of sales of bread and pound cake. Quickly becoming disenchanted with the experience, George took a day off to attend Harvard-Yale football game. His alma mater lost, and George Huntington Hartford also lost his position within the family firm. By 1942, Huntington Hartford was investing in property in Santa Monica, purchasing a house built by the opera singer Runyon Canyon during the war in 1942. In 1948, Hartford also launched a modeling agency in Los Angeles and New York so that he could be with girls. And it is here where his employees began picking up young girls off the street for him to sleep with. Lisa Rebecca Gubernick, who wrote a biography of George Huntington Hartford II entitled Squandered Fortune, stated, Hartford believed that if he bought enough and built enough, he could convert those bald-faced mentions in the society columns to lasting fame, positing that the A&P heir hoped to build a cultural empire. Indeed, throughout the 1940s and 50s, Huntington Hartford attempted to make a name for himself in the art scene, but the incoherence of his vision meant that all his grand projects eventually failed. By this time, he was becoming known as a patron to the arts, which continued to be the case when Hartford had met his second wife, the young Marjorie Sue Steele, who was recorded in the New York Times as being a former nightclub cigarette girl. He had met Marjorie while she was selling cigarettes at Ciro's nightclub in Los Angeles, and he had enticed her into a relationship by purchasing her merchandise. His ruse worked, and by all accounts, she became the favorite of his four wives he had during his lifetime. At the time that Huntington Hartford began wooing Marjorie Steele, she was already engaged to Charlie Chaplin's son, with a legend of silent movies himself being the one to advise her to leave his own son and marry the wealthy Huntington Hartford instead. There you are. There they are again, Huntington Hartford and Marjorie Steele, courtesy of July 1986 edition of Vanity Fair. In the 1950s, Huntington Hartford began purchasing properties in New York City, Palm Beach, and New Jersey. He also purchased the famous Hollywood estate known as the Pines, a London townhouse, a property in France, as well as buying a house on Hog Island in the Bahamas. He later purchased Hog Island entirely in 1959 and renamed it Paradise Island, soon attempting to turn it into a haven for illicit sex parties involving underage girls. He even gave Paradise Island its own flag, which he shaped like a pea, a symbol he also wanted to put on the moon as a symbol for world peace. The decade of the 1950s was seen as the most productive years of his life. Bolstered by Marjorie's ambitions as an actress and a painter, he began investing in the movie industry, produced one of his wife's more successful movies in 1951, opened a theater in Hollywood, and founded what was described as an artist colony. During these busy years, he found time to write an adaptation of Jane Eyre for Marjorie, which had a short run on Broadway and eventually flopped after Marjorie pulled out of the project because she just decided it would hurt her reputation as an actress. To that, Huntington Hartford had stated, I think she was right. Hartford began investing in all manners of grand projects during this era, all of which were to be failures under his leadership. This was also the fate of his marriage to Marjorie, which was heading to divorce by the end of the 1950s. Huntington Hartford, Ivor Bryce, and James Bond. By 1960, Huntington Hartford's marriage to Marjorie was coming to an end, and he was celebrated by organising elite sex parties, as well as becoming a regular at Hoddibbin's sordid London-based events. At the famous, sometimes satanic-themed sex parties held by Hoddibbin and Mariella Capes, aka Mariella Novotny, George Huntington Hartford mingled with the elites of London's gangsters such as the Cray twins, as well as many of the main characters involved in the Profumo affair, an event which saw the downfall of the British government. One of the people who sometimes attended these gatherings was Stephen Ward, who was to become the main patsy in the Profumo scandal, resulting in his death by overdose while in custody during one of the most high-profile court cases Britain had ever seen. Douglas Thompson mentions Huntington Hartford's relationship with Stephen Ward and Horace Dibbin in his book Stephen Ward's Scapegoat, stating, "Throughout the 1950s, employees would approach young women on the streets of on Hartford's behalf. In London, Stephen Ward, sketchpad in hand, did that for him. He also sketched a drawing of a girl being pleasured round the world by a machine for Huntington Hartford, who gave it to a friend of Kim Waterfield. The billionaire American liked girls in the flesh, as did producer Harry Alan Towers, who was invited to London party thrown by Huntington Hartford. There with Stephen Ward and Hoddibbin was Mariella Novotny." Commenting on Marjorie Steele, Thompson also states, "The first of his four wives was Marjorie Steele, an aspiring actress. When they married in 1949, she was a teenager. Huntington Hartford liked Prime." The latter statement was partly false, as Marjorie Steele was actually the second of Huntington Hartford's wives. However, he was also known for liking Prime, with Thompson going on to say, "As it was, George Huntington Hartford was one of the world's richest men and a fan of Hoddibbin's sex parties, found 18-year-old Mariella a little on the old side." In fact, Stephen Ward's attempts to entice Huntington Hartford into Mariella Novotny's bedchambers opened up a very dangerous can of worms, which eventually contributed to Ward's untimely death, something we'll explore more later in this series. One of the most interesting associates of Huntington Hartford was his brother-in-law, a man named Ivor Bryce. Born John Felix Charles Bryce in 1906, Ivor's father had made his fortune dealing in guano, while his mother had worked as a painter with a side job writing detective novels. During World War I, to escape potential Zeppelin attacks, the 11-year-old Bryce was sent to Cornwall. There, on a Cornish beach, Bryce met a young Ian Fleming, and the two boys formed an enduring friendship. Fleming and Bryce attended Eton College together, and later on went on to co-publish a magazine called The Wyvern, where Bryce's mother used her connections to persuade famous artists such as Welsh painter Augustus John to contribute drawings. The magazine was also used as a far-right propaganda tool, and at one point they even published an article praising the British Fascist Party. There's Ivor Bryce, the only foreign national who served in the American OSS. Apparently, there was more, I've been told, but I've not been shown evidence of it. But anyway, that's his card, OSS 991. During World War II, Bryce began working for William Stevenson, who was the head of the British Security Coordination, BSC, operating out of New York. The BSC was an offshoot of MI6, which was set up by Winston Churchill to investigate enemy activities, prevent sabotage of any British interests in the Americas, and to positively influence American sentiment towards the British. They used many underhand methods to achieve their goals, and Bryce was charged with stirring up trouble between the United States of America and their various Latin American neighbors, initially by using the threat of Nazi infiltration to force specific American policy actions. In Thomas Mal's book published in 1998 entitled Desperate Deception, British Covert Operations in United States 1939 to 1944, it states, Bryce worked in the Latin American office section of the BSC, which was run by Dicky Coit, known as Coitus Interruptus, because there was little evidence of the German plot to take over Latin America. Ivor found it difficult to excite Americans about the threat. To remedy American disinterest in the potential Nazi infiltration of Latin America, Bryce created fake propaganda, which successfully helped to sour relations between US and Cuba. In his biography, You Only Live Once, Bryce writes about an early operation to undermine the Cuban-American relationship via the creation of a map, which was intended to be given to US Congress as evidence that Cuba was helping the Nazis set up secret bases in their country. Bryce writes, sketching out a trial map of the possible changes on my blotter, I came up with one showing the probable relocation of territories that would appeal to Berlin. It was very convincing. The more I studied it, the more sense it made. Were a genuine German map of this kind to be discovered and publicized among the American firsters, what a commotion would be caused. In this instance, the ruse was carried out successfully and became a catalyst for Congress's decision to dismantle what remained of their neutrality legislation, which went on to pave the way for a more acrimonious relationship between the US and their Cuban neighbors. During World War II, Ivor Bryce built a property in Jamaica, and his friend Ian Fleming, who was then personal assistant to the Director of British Naval Intelligence, Admiral John Godfrey, had decided that he would also live in Jamaica and write full-time after the war. In 1945, Bryce helped Fleming find some land and a house outside Oracabessa, with Fleming calling his new-found retreat Goldeneye, the name of one of his projects during the war. In 1950, Ivor Bryce married into Huntington Hartford's family and wed Josephine Huntington Hartford. Like George Huntington Hartford II, his sister, Josephine Bryce, had inherited wealth from their grandfather, yet, unlike George, she invested it well, concentrating on her own racehorses and becoming very successful in her own right. During the late 1950s, Ivor Bryce, Ian Fleming, and George Huntington Hartford also began producing films together. In April 1953, Fleming had published a novel entitled Casino Royale, which introduced a reader to a British secret agent serving Queen and Country who went by the name James Bond. The book was successful, and soon Fleming began working with Ernst Cuneo to develop scripts for James Bond's cinematic debut. Cuneo had been an important, if not vital, figure in the operations of the aforementioned BSC during World War II. He also admitted to passing information about American decision-making on to British spies during the time, where the Brits were intent on manipulating US action. Cuneo states, given the time, the situation, and the mood, it's not surprising, however, that BSC also went beyond the legal, the ethical, and the proper. Throughout the neutral Americas, and especially in the US, it ran espionage agents, tampered with mails, tapped telephone, smuggled propaganda into the country, disrupted public gatherings, covertly subsidized newspaper, radios, and organizations, perpetrated forgeries, even palming one off to the President of the United States, violated the Alien Registration Act, shanghaied sailors numerous times, and possibly murdered one or more person in this country. Xanadu or Bust. In April 1959, the film journal Kinematograph Weekly reported that producer Kevin McClory and financier Ivor Bryce, who headed Xanadu Productions, are planning to build their own studio in the Bahamas. The Bahama government was keen to see a film production company establish itself on one of their 3,000 islands. They were quick to offer the company tax cuts and other incentives under the Encouragement of Industry Act to entice Bryce and McClory to invest in the Bahamas. You can watch Newshound 11, Hunting for Xanadu. which looks at a company called Xanadu Productions soon after. The amazing story. You'll have to watch it. Kevin O'Donovan McClory had originally met Ivor and Josephine Bryce during a visit to their villa on Providence Island in the Bahamas. The villa itself is called Xanadu, to discuss collaborating on a film called The Boy and the Bridge. The Sunday Mirror reported on the match in September 1959, stating that the upshot was that Bryce went into partnership with Kevin. Bryce's money and Kevin's know-how to make a film. Also in April 1959, Ian Fleming wrote a letter to McClory concerning potential James Bond movie ideas, with that letter also being used in a 1963 court case between Bryce and McClory after their business relationship eventually broke down. However, in August 1959, McClory and Bryce were still on agreeable terms and were reportedly about to start work on their new studio in the Bahamas. Basing the production company and much of the development of James Bond franchise in the Bahamas made sense for many reasons. The Huntington Hartford children had both purchased homes in the Bahamas, with George's Paradise Island being located very close to Ivor and Josephine Bryce's Xanadu Villa. But the main reason for Bond being based in the Bahamas was McClory himself, who claimed that he was responsible for a large part of Ian Fleming's novel Thunderball being set in the Bahamas. McClory claimed that the previously mentioned 1963 court case that Bryce and Fleming had tried to oust him as a producer of the proposed Bond movie film. Eventually, like the relationship between McClory and Bryce, the plans to build a studio in the Bahamas began to unravel. George Huntington Hartford had promised that his redevelopment of Hog Island into Paradise Island was to see the creation of a dignified vacation resort. In 1960, the New York Times reported that the island in Nassau in the Bahamas was to be a place for artists and writers, socialites and diplomats, teachers and scientists, sportsmen and students, in an atmosphere of cultural enjoyment. But Huntington Hartford was going to have to work hard to make his Paradise Island vision a reality, especially if he was going to attract the right crowd. In November 1962, the project was described as the most elaborate resort, primping for its first full winter of operations. It's the $23 million Paradise Island project of Huntington Hartford. Just 15 minutes across Nassau Harbor by special boat. This holiday complex encompasses a French restaurant, a 52-room hotel, lavish tropical gardens, a swimming pool, and superb tennis courts. When the Island Ocean Club finally opened in 1962, elites jetted in from all over the globe, with over 1,000 people reported to have attended Paradise Island's official launch party. But by March 1964, Huntington Hartford's island resort was experiencing problems with crime after gunmen held up a group of tourists who were visiting Nassau and on their way to Paradise Island Resort. 4 men were reported to have stopped a taxi after ramming it with their vehicle and said to have stolen the belongings of the taxi's occupants. At the time, the tourists were traveling back from a night at the Bahamian Club, Nassau's only gambling casino at the time. The taxi driver also told the police that the bandits all sounded like Americans, even though the robbers managed to get away with only around $1,000 in cash. Their haul contained some extremely pricey jewelry, including a diamond ring worth $250,000, and their heist saw them net items totaling in excess of $750,000, which was the equivalent to over 7 million in today's money. That's the Huntington Hartford estate, the Richard Harris estate, destination on Luxury TV. It shows us around the estate. As it was with every other endeavor which Huntington Hartford undertook, he soon became disinterested in his Paradise Island project. By October 1964, his resort was up for sale. The press reported statements by Huntington Hartford's broker, a man named John Machio, admitting that the island had never been profitable, blaming the 52-room hotel for limiting the venture's profitability, saying, "You can't pay for men like Pancho Gonzalez, the island tennis pro, and Gary Player, the golf pro, with 52 paying guests." The 700-acre property, which Huntington Hartford had originally purchased from a Swedish industrialist named Dr. Axel Wenner-Gren in 1959, was finally reported as being sold 7 years later. Huntington Hartford didn't get the 32 million he originally wanted, with the resort eventually selling for around 14 million instead. A man about London town. Many wealthy elites, such as George Huntington Hartford, had significant and close ties to various members of different national intelligence agencies during this period. Many of these agencies were still evolving in terms of scope and scale and style of their operations throughout the 1950s and 1960s. American and British intelligence services were not fighting their Soviet foe publicly, and instead of taking certain actions themselves, they were often found utilizing front organizations such as BSC to coerce their allies into making certain decisions. That's again from Vanity Fair 1986, Huntington Hartford II there. Central to the ideological war between East and West during this era was the battleground of London. The Cold War was rarely fought in the open, and in major capital cities such as London, spies representing all sides were conducting deals in the shadows. This put nightclubs of London on the front line of an information war, which had the power to sour international relations or potentially spark wide-reaching international incidents. This era of spy games was made much more dangerous by the dawning of nuclear age, with everyone involved believing the risk of nuclear warfare, mutually assured destruction, and potential extinction of life on Earth. To gain access to sexual encounters with young women and girls, men like Huntington Hartford attended these secretive elite sex parties based in London, exposed themselves in more ways than one. While his vast inherited wealth and his many significant and powerful connections afforded Huntington Hartford some protection, the only benefit that these not so private events had for the wealthy billionaire was that they offered him the opportunity to fulfill his carnal desires. However, for the intelligence agents and their associates, these sordid events became a prime place to gather compromising information on powerful people, which could then be used against them later. It shouldn't surprise anyone that organizers of elite sex parties such as Horace Dibbin and George Huntington Hartford II were useful allies for compromise operations run by the various intelligence agencies, whether they knew it or not. Like Horace Dibbin, Huntington Hartford himself gave his companions access to a real underworld of hidden sexual subversion, which many people still think is fantasy. However, this particular era of sexual compromise operations was coming to an end. The people involved were naive to believe that they could control such a complex blackmail operation indefinitely. Soon, a group of much more serious and sinister predators were slowly surrounding the people who thought they occupied the top of intelligence food chain. There was a new wave of spies coming to prominence who were active among the melting pots of both London and Washington, D.C. People such as Tom Corbally were skulking around the American and English capitals and soon would begin to enact the scandal of the decade and bring about the downfall of the British government. Yet, it wasn't only the British government which these intelligence agents intended to coup. They were also looking over the Atlantic towards America and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. There's George Huntington Hartford coming down the stairs there. Soon, this investigation We'll go deep into the actual perfumer affair and the intelligence-linked characters who made it happen. As for George Huntington Hartford, he became a drug addict and lost nearly all his fortune. He spent the last years of his life lamenting his many negative childhood experiences. Bedbound and disgruntled, he eventually died in the Bahamas at the age of 97. And there you go. You can go on an adventure through the source material of the Black Hand series with me here. So we go through all of the source material that made up this article in this Newshound number 16, the original Jeffrey Epstein and 007, Exploring Black Hand 5. Of course, it was originally on Unlimited Hangout. And these are links, of course, to the other Black Hand series, including the Stanley Setti series, which is a kind of an intermission. And if you enjoy this work, if you enjoy this type of stuff, please support me, buy me a coffee, support me on Patreon, come to Ko-Fi. I need your help. I can't do this sort of work without your help. I'm seriously just on my own in that sense with these sort of things. No one else has reported on some of this, and some of it is like really important. We see the cycles repeated, and that is a really important thing to understand. The Epstein case taught me something. Investigating the Epstein case taught me something. It taught me that there's this group of elite who acted a certain way. And then when I've looked back in time, I've seen the same elite, a different generation of them, act in a very similar way, and so on and so forth. You keep going back, you keep finding the same sort of the same game, the same people, the same styles, the same characters, the same events being repeated just in a different time with different technology surrounding it and different events happening. And it's very human. These are very human affairs. But it was really interesting to discover this person who was George Huntington Hartford and then going back throughout time and seeing that he had such a an interesting like amount of connections with people who created something that was like, they all worked on intelligence operations undermining nation states, national interests of other countries, and lying, misinforming, disinforming, tricking people all over the place. And then they wrote it into James Bond. Then they made themselves into the heroes. They made intelligence assets into heroes. So people who had worked for intelligence suddenly make intelligence a hero on the main stage and make this idea of James Bond a character who's works for British intelligence trying to stop these terrible globalists from taking over the world. In actual fact, our intelligence services have helped set up the global elite control. Spectre, the evil organization within James Bond, is created by the James Bonds in reality. They're not separate. They're not trying to fight them. They're not against them. They're part of the establishment. And it was a propaganda piece. James Bond was a propaganda piece. George Huntington Hartford was a useful tool for many people who were around him, extremely rich, wealthy. But in that way that they used Huntington Hartford to propel themselves forward, so did the powerful elite with Jeffrey Epstein. And what was part of the shine about Epstein for these people is he had access to young girls, which also George Huntington Hartford had access to young girls. Stephen Ward, who's central in the Perfumer affair, gets actually killed, dies, takes suicide, takes an overdose, but it's obvious that it's like he's murdered, so it's brushed under the carpet. He's he's very similar to Ghislaine Maxwell in that, going out into the streets and trying to convince young girls to come back and sleep with this billionaire. And so there's repeats within history. And it's a really interesting fair again. George Huntington Hartford hanging around in Hod Dibbin's satanic sex parties. It's all very interesting, and it all looks like things we see again and again. And trust me, in now and in 20 years in the future, the same thing will be happening again. In a sense, you could say George Huntington Hartford II was in the model. Jeffrey Epstein was made in the model of George Huntington Hartford. II, and people like P. Diddy and his parties were kind of like in the model of Epstein, and so on and so forth. And it will keep happening all the way throughout history. There'll be people like this. And they're usually fantasists who are given a chance to make all of their fantasies come true. And that's what George Huntington Hartford II did. So that's the fifth in the Black Hand series. There's another two afterwards. Please come read the Black Hand series. Go read the read-throughs. There's the other four read-throughs are already out now. You can explore the articles as well. There's five news hounds for the Black Hand series, one for each article, where you can go through the history of all of the evidence and the source material of these historic events, including the first of those news hounds, where I actually go around London and find some of the nightclubs of Esmeralda, Gulan, which was an interesting journey, an exciting journey for myself, because when you spend so much time, I mean, these articles, say the first five articles, it took ages. It was possibly like nearly a year to research and write them all. And I'm actually still researching and writing. I have a lovely lady who's helping me to research a load of these so that I can expand them into a book. And we found loads more information, and we're finding more information all the time, because a lot of this information is hidden, of course. It's some of it you only discover by luck, by going to magazines at the time and spending the time going through everything, So a lot of my work is done researching like that, looking for the evidence. So and like I'll spend an entire night looking for something, and it'll make one or two lines in one of these articles. But it's important to do that. It's important to gain the accuracy. It's important to find the evidence before it's lost. So, thank you for being with me on this Johnny Vedmore read through. Buy me a coffee, come to Patreon, support me, or you can support me via Ko-Fi or any other way by newspace.com, and get in contact. I'm interactive. I love it. I love it. I love to talk to people. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time on the Johnny Vedmore read through. Bye.
Shaping a great reset for the post-corona era.